Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Tuesday, December 10th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon and White House correspondent Phil Wegmann. So the person now charged with the murder of UnitedHealthCare CEO Brian Thompson turns out to be a 26-year-old. He's from wealthy Maryland family. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. Carl, you used to cover the courts. He doesn't seem to fit the profile of a lone assassin, or at least the one that I'm thinking of. What do you make of the arrest?
Well, we've learned a lot in the last, 24 hours, Andy. He went to the Gilman School, which is an exclusive prep school in Baltimore. He's from this very prominent family, as you mentioned, Baltimore. He's like 30 cousins, and his grandparents own radio station and country club. He's had a life of privilege, and he went to Penn. When this first happened, we talked about this. We tried to avoid speculating, but you couldn't help it. And I thought he maybe been a elite kid who'd been radicalized at college. Taught that capitalism is bad, and other people thought he'd had whoever this turned out to be before we knew him, that he'd had some horrible run-in himself with the healthcare system. Turns out it may be both. He's clearly an elitist, and he comes from money. He's had all the privileges you could have in life, but he's apparently had terrific back problems, and they can be very painful. I don't know. Of course, none of us know, who his insurance were, if he even had problems with insurance, but he had these problems with his back, and it caused him extreme pain and apparently psychological distress. And about 6 months ago, he seems to have ghosted his friends and disappeared into this world. And he came out of it as an assassin and a political and domestic terrorist. And if he's convicted and he's found competent to stand trial, he's 26 years old. He's going to be in prison for 50 years. It's a tragedy all the way around for the victim and for the family of this defendant.
Yeah. Well, Phil, we've talked on this show about the politics of this and this sort of outpouring of personal stories on the internet, where people are sort of rationalizing him, not outright justifying this cold-blooded murder. How do you view this sort of outpouring of real hatred at the healthcare industry?
Well, certainly the frustration and anger towards a faceless corporation is understandable. But in this case, there was a very real person who bore the brunt of that anger, and that was Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthCare. I think that if you look at his resume and his bio, it's interesting. He's almost the inverse of the assassin. Here you have someone who grew up in Iowa, went to a state school, and sort of climbed the ladder to corporate prominence, doing everything that we tell our kids they're supposed to. Setting aside, though, the morality of these giant insurance companies, though, I think there's something larger going on here, which is that as each of us retreat into our echo chambers and we don't have those conversations and debates over, healthcare or the insurance system, we're seeing political violence become mundane. Even before this assassination this year, we had the first and second Trump assassination attempts. There were the bomb threats on the president-elect's cabinet members. All of these things taken together, I think they lower the bar and they lower the barrier to entry for something that's horrific and something that's un-American. And so debate is good. Killing your political opponents or killing people that you have policy disagreements, well, that's very bad.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about a poll, if you will.
Andy, can we say one more thing?
Sure.
I wanted to actually ask you about the Biden administration had spent a lot of time, 4 years, its Justice Department, identifying domestic terrorists on the right and saying, these people who've gone to abortion clinics and the Proud Boys and white supremacists. But we've had all of this. We've had an awful lot of violence from the left. The most chilling event here in Washington was the shooting up of these Republican congressmen on a baseball diamond by a left-wing activist or a political guy who'd been radicalized from watching MSNBC. It sounds like, and volunteering. He volunteered on the Bernie Sanders campaign. Now, Bernie Sanders certainly wasn't to blame, and he said it was very forceful. But I wonder if the new Justice Department is going to start taking a look at what's going on the left to cause some of this violence as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I think but in fairness, at least in this example, I'm not sure anyone could have seen this coming from this guy. I mean, he doesn't fit any profile. He has no prior record. I mean, no fingerprints on him one way or the other. So.
And he left that note. He has that manifesto, which he said, "I'll save you a lot of time. I acted alone."
Yeah,
which seems like a confession. But to your point, it doesn't sound like he was part of an organized.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not like the Weather Underground or some of the things that we remember from our youth. But it's a good point, and I think boy, it would be nice if the temperature sort of went down a little bit. I still remain. I'm just struck by the number of people who are in the press and stuff who sort of have like I say, not so much supported or justified, but rationalized this heinous murder of a father of two children. And the fact that we're so callous about it, it's really disturbing to me. But like I said, I wanted to talk about this poll, this new, it's from INI, about immigration. It turns out, Phil, that about 69% of Americans favor the deportation of illegal criminals. So pretty popular. And 55% favor supporting using the U.S. military to deport illegals. So this is a pretty popular policy and something that Trump ran on, obviously. But what do you make of that poll, and what do you make of those numbers?
It's popular and easy to tell a pollster that you want deportations, but actually carrying out those deportations is an entirely different thing when you see images of families being torn apart on the nightly news. And make no mistake, after tens of millions of folks came into this country illegally during the previous administration, we're going to be in a scenario where if Tom Homan, the border czar for the incoming administration, gets his way, his hope is to go after everyone who is here illegally. He told me just last month that no one is off the table. Yes, they're going to start with criminals, but if you're here illegally, he said, that you should realize that you're going to be brought into accordance with the law. I think that during the first 100 days and the first year of the second Trump administration, this is something that they're going to be focusing on very clearly internally. J.D. Vance has already talked about how, yes, the polling favors deportations, but once they put this plan into action, there's potential for public opinion to shift pretty swiftly and pretty quickly.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I mean, this poll was on deporting illegal criminals.
People who came to this country have a criminal record. But Andy, it shows you how much the debates changed, though, since you and I, and when this, you'll remember the bill that Ronald Reagan signed that legalized almost 3 million people, most of them from Mexico. The idea was you had to swear when you came in to this country you wouldn't be a burden economically on the country. No one would have ever thought you would let in a person who had a criminal record.
Yeah,
and the debates shifted really quite radically. I was actually struck that 69% wasn't higher. You're saying people who've committed murders in other country or rapes or violent crimes, only 7 out of 10 Americans want them deported back to where they came from. I actually thought that was eye-opening in the other direction.
Huh. Well, the other number in that poll that struck me was that 53% of urban dwellers, it was their term, support sanctuary mayors, which I thought was striking.
Sanctuary what?
Giving sanctuary mayors. The sanctuary cities led by what they called sanctuary mayors.
Oh.
So I thought that was higher than I would have expected, especially given the fact that 77% want to, get rid of criminals at least.
Well, don't show Eric Adams that poll.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So the other number was that among total swing voters who ultimately chose Trump, immigration was a key issue. 77% of them believed it was extremely or very accurate to say Democrats are not tough enough on addressing the border crisis. 73% felt that Democrats supported immigrants more than they supported American citizens. So again, I mean, it just shows you how strong this issue was during the campaign, and if anything, it seems to be building, Phil.
Donald Trump would go back and forth between which issue he wanted to highlight more, the economy or illegal immigration. And a lot of it is advisors were telling him, no, it's the economy, stupid. This is a golden issue for you to run on inflation, on high gas prices, etc. But going into Election Day, even as he went to cast his vote there in Florida, he said that he thought that the border was the #1 issue. And if you look at this polling, and certainly how he expanded his base, he might have been right.
Well, guys, we're going to have to take a break. We'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil Wegmann and Carl Cannon. And Phil, you wrote about Tulsi Gabbard, who was making the rounds yesterday on Capitol Hill. She's, of course, a former Democrat who was Trump's pick to be the director of national intelligence. How did she do among her colleagues?
Among Republicans, they were happy to have her. Number of Republicans were ready to roll out the red carpet. She started the day by having breakfast with Senator Joni Ernst. Then she had back-to-back meetings with other Republicans. This is not unusual for your first day of a charm campaign to start with the party of the president who nominated you. But I was surprised to learn from sources directly aware of her scheduling there that despite her overtures to Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee, she hasn't been able to set up a single meeting. That goes from, Senator Warner, who's currently the chairman, on down, through the rank and file there. She had one meeting that was scheduled, but then it was subsequently canceled. It seems that they're holding their former colleague at arm's length.
She met with Assad 8 years ago, Carl. At that point, she said he wasn't a threat to the United States. Is that still going to be sort of controversial for her, or with Assad out of the? Well, I guess he's holed up in Moscow now. Maybe that's not such a big issue.
Well, it sort of underscores that he was a stooge of the Russians. So Hillary Clinton is not going to be apologizing anytime soon. But, in 2017, she went there. 2019, I guess, Hillary Clinton attacked her, said she was a Russian asset. Tulsi Gabbard gave as good as she got. She said Hillary Clinton was corrupt and a warmonger. So, that the judges, decreed a draw in their bout. Andrew Yang weighed in and sided with Tulsi Gabbard, sort of signaling, younger Democrats and independents kind of think she may have a message here. But Phil's story was eye-opening. We have on page 1 today, Tuesday, and you'd think they'd want to talk to her. Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. Now Kamala Harris has lost to Donald Trump. He's the president. He's nominated her. You'd think they'd want to do their own thinking and ask her some questions and hear from her and have her explain that. She's talked about it. She thinks it was a fact-finding mission. She wasn't negotiating on part of the United States. She was a member of the House. She's also a veteran, a combat veteran of the United States military. You'd think that could afford her some grace and some respect among these Democrats. My guess is if they read Phil's story, they'll be ashamed of themselves and they'll start putting her on their she'll put her on their schedule.
Well, and this is a famously bipartisan committee, Senate Intelligence. Avril Haines, who's in that position now for President Biden, she was advanced out of committee unanimously. I think that she got 89 votes in the Senate. Generally, this is one of these cabinet positions that's supposed to be beyond politics. But make no mistake, while Republicans are happy that Democrats are being rude and they're sort of reveling in that type of early bad behavior, Tulsi Gabbard is key to what Donald Trump sees as his realignment. I was talking with John McLaughlin, the president-elect's longtime pollster, and he pointed out that some of these low propensity voters, these independents and former Democrats who voted for Donald Trump, they might not be there when Republicans need them in the midterms. He said that Republicans were renting those voters. So to really expand the tent, to achieve the realignment that Donald Trump wants, I think that's why the president-elect is so eager to get a former Democrat like Tulsi Gabbard into his cabinet.
Yeah.
She's also, like I said, a combat veteran. She was the first Hindu in Congress, I believe. She is, normally Democrats would be celebrating a
Right.
hire like this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting too that, you've got Vance, you've got her, you've got Pete Hegseth. These are all veterans of the war on terror. They're all sort of, skeptical of imperial overreach, but yet very supportive of the military. You've got Mike Waltz, former Green Beret, who will be a national security advisor. He served in Afghanistan. So you have this interesting generation, Phil, of warriors, really, who are, for the military, but maybe not bought on for all the mission, at least the missions that they've been assigned to do when they were serving.
J.D. Vance walked out to a song called America First at every single rally that he went to. And it was an old anti-war ballad from the Bush administration. And it was talking about how the United States should focus on its own problems at home before going overseas to destroy enemies abroad. And that kind of is a nice little vignette if you want to look at where Republicans are. They've adopted the anti-war arguments of Democrats during the Bush years. They're ready to turn the page on this adventurism and this neoliberalism that defined the last 2 decades. Meanwhile, you have hawks, most prominent on the left, saying no, that's not a good idea, and that's this idea is really going to be put to the test. Yes, when you have Tulsi Gabbard, Mike Waltz, J.D. Vance in positions of authority, but it's not just an academic one. The world really is on fire. You've got a land war in Europe. You've got this conflict not just in Israel, but also in Syria. There's an increasingly aggressive China in the Indo-Pacific. So we'll see how this actually is put into place when it's not just a question on paper, but it's a question in the real world.
And Carl, you've got a Secretary of State incoming who is more of that sort of old, sort of almost Bush-like, sort of worldview.
Well, Marco Rubio is a traditionalist, and he's tough on China, tough on Russia, promotes human rights. Either party should be comfortable with him. But to your point, Andy and Phil used the phrase neoliberal, and when Bush was president, we're talking about neocons. Actually, what this is sort of a debate that goes back in this country more than 100 years. But they don't like being called isolationists, but they have their own word. They say we're against forever wars. So let's take these two camps, the forever war camp and the isolationists. We were arguing about this in World War I. And, it's never been, strictly speaking, a partisan issue. There in the original isolationists that were, some of them belonged to the Progressive Party, like Hiram Johnson, some were Republicans, like Bob La Follette, some of them were Democrats. It's not, strictly speaking, a left-right issue. It's how you see American projecting force in the world and what you think is the efficacy of military power to bring about change in the world and make us safe. So it's a debate that we should have. And the only thing I would say is that I'd like, they should talk about it on the merits. They shouldn't just attack Tulsi Gabbard with these, name calling. They should address their concerns about her worldview and the president's, but do so in a way that allows the debate to take forward instead of just shutting people down and slurring.
I mean, Eli Lake at the Free Press did this. He's a staunch opponent of the worldview that Gabbard inhabits. And yet he said, if you set aside this slur calling her a Russian asset, after all, this is someone who maintains a top secret clearance and has been in the military for 20 years now. If you set that aside, you can also take her to task for her views on foreign policy. And it would seem that there's a lot of opportunities to condemn or support Gabbard, but without going the Hillary Clinton route and questioning her loyalty.
I was struck. Mike Waltz was on one of the shows yesterday, I think it was, and he was talking about sort of this issue, but he said, Trump is strongly in favor of defending America, and if American interests are ever really at risk, he will be the first to act, and he will act swiftly and strongly. And Carl, it does seem to me that's always the problem with trying to take a position, before the S hits the fan. I mean, something's going to happen, and the world will force this new administration to make decisions about stuff, and we'll have to see what happens at that point, whether they say no, that we're going to stay out of this, or if American lives are involved or American bases or whatever. It doesn't take much for it to become an American. We're everywhere in the world.
Yeah, but you'd also like to see into the future. I mean, if this Ukrainians fighting Russians, you say, well, all right, it's terrible what's happened to Ukraine. It's not. What's it got to do with us? I understand that argument. Well, then the other argument is, what makes anybody think Vladimir Putin's going to stop at Kiev? What's next? Moldova, right. The Baltics. This is the Hitler analogy, and I'm not saying Vladimir Putin is Hitler, but a European leader who just wants to swallow up other countries, you have to start saying, okay, well then if he goes after Poland, are we going to fight? How about France, England? I mean, at some point it becomes an American issue, and then you have to say, and if we had confronted it earlier, maybe we wouldn't have escalated. That's the argument on the other side. The only way to know for sure is to be able to see into the future, and none of us can.
Yeah. Well, Phil, we got about a minute to wrap up here. Just give us an overview of where Trump's team stands on the Hill right now. Is anybody in trouble? It seems like Pete Hegseth has sort of turned the corner a little bit, at least that seems to be in the last 48 hours or so.
Certainly at first, the expectation was that RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard were going to be the nominations that were the heaviest lifts. We've seen, though, that Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense, he's gotten a lot of heat. A big development here, though, was when you had Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, who was the swing vote on foreign affairs, signal that she was open to a Hegseth nomination. And she told us, in an exclusive interview last week, that she wasn't trying to sink him. She didn't want the job either. So it seems like he's solidifying support. The longer he can stick around, I think the better his odds are. But yeah, this is Donald Trump saying, I won an election. I realign the Republican Party. Now all he needs is Republicans to get on board and give him the people that he wants. That might be easier said than done.
Well, we're going to keep an eye on it. Thanks, Phil. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Phil Wegmann and Carl Cannon. We're going to take a break and be back after this.
All right, welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics, talking now with Julie Kelly, who writes for Real Clear Investigations. Has an extraordinary story. We ran it Monday. It was on our front page. It was also on Real Clear Investigations page. And the lead tells you, which sort of sets it up, even as Donald Trump has promised to act very quickly on pardons for the J6 defendants, the Justice Department, Joe Biden's Justice Department, and the judges in D.C. are just sort of hell-mel trying to prosecute these people, still making arrests, I guess, and making sure that people are given prison terms. And Julie sounds openly sort of dismissing Donald Trump's promise of pardons.
These judges absolutely are, Carl. It's pretty stunning to see not only how this DOJ continues to investigate and arrest individuals. In fact, they arrested a man from Florida this past Monday. They started 3 jury trials of J6 defendants on Monday as well. And now a few judges are accelerating, also putting these people in prison on low-level misdemeanors, remanding them into immediate custody instead of waiting the typical few months after sentencing, because they want these January 6th defendants to go to jail, even as Donald Trump promised as recently as this weekend that he was going to pardon J6ers, which we're assuming he will start with those who are convicted of those low-level nonviolent misdemeanors. So once again, the DC courts snubbing their nose at higher authorities, which we also saw with the Supreme Court ruling, and this DOJ doing whatever it can to increase the total J6 caseload before January 20th.
So, there was this old Pogo cartoon, and I think maybe it was Thomas Nast. The Supreme Court reads the election returns. But these judges don't read the election returns. And I guess I could argue it either way. One is that they're showing a vindictive side, which is, if if you read this story, I'll tell our listeners and viewers that comes through. But the other argument on the other side, Julie, is it's a separation of powers issue, and that what the courts are supposed to do, whatever was said during a campaign, they really supposed to follow the law. I think that's what they would argue, and what they are arguing. What's your response to that?
You're right, Carl. So some of them are arguing a separation of powers interest. Article 3, that they are, of course, independent from the executive branch. Well, yes, except that there's oversight mechanism by Article, 1 and 2. And unfortunately, Carl, because these judges are so rogue, because they are so unaccountable to anyone else, of course, they all have district court judges in Washington and circuit court lifetime appointments. There's no way to get rid of them except for impeachment. And so they have run the show in Washington, D.C., and that's what they're used to. Now, we can't even get an estimate of how much this total J6 prosecution has cost the American taxpayers. Carl, we are almost at 1,600 J6 defendants. This is the largest criminal investigation and prosecution in DOJ history. So at least they have some accountability to the taxpayers and not continue to waste our money sending misdemeanants to federal prison. So this just demonstrates what I have been covering and reporting for almost 4 years. This corrupt DOJ going after Donald Trump, his family, his associates, and his voters, with the DC courts acting as nothing more than a rubber stamp. They are there to protect the rights of defendants from government overreach. We have seen none of that. And now they're kind of ruffling their feathers like, well, don't tell us what to do. We don't care if in 45 days there's going to be a new attorney general and a new president. And what they're missing, Carl, is that the results of the 2024 election were a partial repudiation of the lawfare against the president and his supporters. This message has been lost on the DC federal courts, and this is why you see this rush to judgment, putting them on trial, sending them to jail, even bringing new charges against J6ers from almost 4 years ago.
Julie, you've covered these trials, and you've written. I urge our listeners and viewers to go back and look and see your reporting. What's come through in some of the reporting, I infer this. You're very careful with how you write, but there's almost a kind of animus towards these defendants on the part of these federal judges. And where do you think that? First of all, is that am I being too strong there? Is that fair? And if so, where's that come from?
It is absolutely an animus. I have seen this firsthand, Carl. Now, of course, there's no video or audio access to these courts, which is why these judges can get away with saying and doing what they have been doing. You have to be there to cover it. So I have been in, I can't tell you, countless trials and sentencing hearings. I'll actually be in court again this Thursday covering J6 related trials. And there is open contempt for J6ers by these judges. And I'm not just talking Democrat judges. These are Republican judges. Some of the Trump appointees and the Reagan appointee, Royce Lamberth, who I highlight in my piece at Real Clear this week, they have the most contempt for J6ers. They really feel like this was a domestic terror attack, that Americans from across the country invaded their personal and professional fiefdom. Of course, most of these judges are creatures of Washington. They used to work for the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. Roughly 40% of the judges work for the same government agency now prosecuting J6ers. So they really have a completely different view than how the majority of Americans view the events of January 6th. This is to the extent, Carl, that judges have to lie about what happened. I point this out in my piece, how Judge Lamberth last week claimed that 5 police officers died as a result of January 6th. That is a total media fabrication. For a federal judge to repeat that in a federal government court document is so egregious, but they are beholden to maintaining the J6 narrative because this has been their life's work for almost 4 years. They did not see the victory of Donald Trump. They did not see the unraveling of their work for the past 4 years, and they are not happy about it.
Julie, my own view is that when you're going to participate in an election, you have to abide by the by the results, and that Donald Trump was way out of line, not just on January 6th, but from September on. It was my view. This is just my opinion. It was irresponsible of him, and that these people who responded were in the wrong. But facts are important. As John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. The only person who died a violent death that day was an unarmed woman shot by the Capitol Police. And I've noticed that this, there were a couple of suicides. There were the policeman who died mysteriously, and the New York Times had said he was hit with a fire extinguisher. He wasn't. And there were a couple of people on the pro-Trump side who had heart attacks. I mean, it wasn't. No, there were people who died, but where you have a federal judge saying that these police officers were killed, you wonder if there's any mechanism. Shouldn't an appellate court look at that? If you're being sentenced based on a judge saying factually incorrect things from the bench, do you have any recourse?
Well, you do, except then it goes to the DC Circuit, which is run by an Obama appointed chief judge and heavily populated with Democrat activist judges. But I do want to push back a little bit on what you said about what happened after the 2020 election. You can disagree.
Please do. This is good.
Well, I enjoy this, and I know you do too. You can certainly criticize how Donald Trump and his legal team handled the post-2020 election investigations and lawsuits. However, I think a lot of the frustration by Trump supporters on January 6th is that there was no relief, that the courts, contrary to the narrative, did not pick up 60 plus lawsuits. The Supreme Court in December refused to hear a very valid lawsuit filed by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, signed by at least 16 other state attorney generals and over 100 Republican House members, with evidence of voting and election fraud in 4 states. The Supreme Court refused to consider that. The Supreme Court refused to consider legitimate lawsuits out of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that had nothing to do with Trump or his campaign. And so the frustration on January 6th was that there was no legitimate vetting of the election results. Now, that is what was going to happen on January 6th. As you recall, the proceedings that day would mostly revolve around House members and Republican senators who wanted to call for a 10-day election audit. They were going to spend at least 12 hours vetting election fraud in 6 states. And that started with the state of Arizona. Paul Gosar and Ted Cruz were beginning this debate about what happened in Arizona. The protest that day shut down those proceedings, which raises, of course, a lot of unanswered questions about why the Capitol was intentionally insecure, why Nancy Pelosi and others denied repeated requests for extra National Guard men, something that Donald Trump had suggested a few days earlier. What about the pipe bomber? We still don't have that individual, and we're still awaiting the report that will be very exculpatory, and that is the number of federal agents out of the DOJ, including FBI informants, who were involved before and on the events of January 6th. But setting all that aside, Carl, the law has to be applied equally, and that is not what we've seen in this situation. You have federal laws that have never been applied to political protesters in this manner being applied only to J6ers. It was so egregious, the Supreme Court had to overturn this year its DOJ's most common felony.
Well, look, we don't agree on some of the facts and some of the interpretation, but I'm sure glad you're doing this reporting for Real Clear Investigations, because the mainstream media is, our friends, and I come out of that world, have a separate narrative, and there have to be people presenting these other facts. So, Julie Kelly, thank you for what you do, and thank you for being on our show. Have a good evening.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined now by political scientist and author Lara M. Brown and Carl Cannon, who's stuck around to do this interview. So, Lara, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me here today.
So today, President Biden spoke at the Brookings Institution, really launching a defense of his economic record. He's got about 40 odd days left in the administration, but the public view of his economic performance is pretty dismal. The RCP average has him at 39% job approval rating on the economy, 35% approval rating on inflation. So, Laura, what did he talk about today, and what do you make of his legacy?
Well, I think there's two sides to this legacy. There is the reality and there is the perception. And the perception has dogged him really for over a year, since inflation began spiking in the wake of all of the new government spending that was enacted in the first year of his presidency. And so the perception is we have not, as a country, really managed to escape the worst problems of the pandemic. There is somehow this belief that we're still dealing with massive inflation, that jobs are maybe not necessarily as plentiful as they are, and that wage growth has been stagnant, even though the numbers tell us otherwise. President Biden did sort of invoke President Ronald Reagan in talking about the fact that facts are stubborn and facts are in his favor. But what is not in his favor and what has not been in his favor and seriously contributed to Vice President Harris losing the presidential campaign is the perception. This has been a difficult economy for most Americans according to the way they feel, not necessarily the way things are.
Carl, weigh in here. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I hear that. But Laura, there are some, he dealt so poorly with inflation when it first hit. The administration first denied it was happening. Then they said it was temporary. Then they said it was Vladimir Putin's fault. Then they said it was supply chain's fault. Then they said it was actually Donald Trump's fault, still 2 years into the administration. Finally, then they acknowledged it, but they said it won't last long. By the time they addressed it, opinion had solidified. It was like George H.W. Bush in the economy. People thought, this guy doesn't get what I'm going through. And so in that sense, it's a communications job, the presidency, and he didn't communicate very well at all. And he always prided himself on this, on getting what working class people were feeling. So I don't think it was an injustice. And the other thing, Laura, I'll say is that the still tough thing, and we don't talk about it much, is interest rates are too high. I don't blame President Biden directly for that, but they blame Jimmy Carter. I mean, the president sort of has to take that. But it's hard to buy a new car. It's hard to buy a house. You've got this whole generation of these young people, and partly they didn't vote for Biden the way they did the first time because they thought, well, this guy doesn't get what I'm going through. He doesn't understand my life.
Yeah, I mean, look, I will completely agree with you that I think President Biden did a horrible job in sort of selling his agenda. They came up with this idea of Bidenomics, and even though he talks about, building the economy essentially from the middle out and the bottom up, and he was very, strong in favor of the unions. He helped bail out the Teamsters pension. He walked picket lines. They passed a number of pieces of sort of legislation, whether it was the CHIPS Act or the infrastructure bill, all of which are going to continue to help this economy. He wasn't able to tell the American people what he did. And the thing that he did that Larry Summers acknowledged in the first year of the administration was that American Rescue Plan was just too big, and it was inflationary. And the reason why it was too big is because it came on the heels of a Republican lame duck, Congress and a Republican president passing an $800 billion rescue plan that December. So, I mean, I do think all of this makes sense within the context of the whole 4 years. And Americans are not wrong for their perceptions, but it is also true that the Fed took too long to raise rates, and they've now, I would argue, have taken too long to lower them. We have inflation sort of coming back, partly because I would argue that interest rates didn't come down fast enough, which would have actually spurred some of the housing and auto buying that you're talking about.
Yeah, Laura, I wonder, because I remember you and I talked about this before the election, and you were at that point telling me that, all these economic numbers were moving in Biden's direction. And that may be true. Apparently they didn't move there fast enough or enough to change the direction of the election. But is the irony here I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, Trump is going to get a pretty good economy when he starts office, right? I mean, the stock market's going through the roof and jobs are being created. Inflation is down. So when people stand back, and that's why I wanted to talk about his legacy a little bit, in 5-10 years, when people start writing the history books of this administration, will they remember it differently than people are feeling about it right now?
Well, I think they will. I mean, but I think Carl's right to compare this to George H.W. Bush, that, there is a sense that he wasn't on the ball with respect to the economy. And I think that will persist for Biden in the near future, even though we know now, right, that the economy was starting to kind of pull out of recession, in that early time of, Clinton's presidency. And we also know that Biden is handing over an economy that is very strong. And this is why I think Biden invoked Ronald Reagan, because he wants people in the coming years to say, look, here was Biden's economy, the envy of the world, according to The Economist. And here's what Trump has now created for us. And if tariffs come and interest rates have to spike again, and all of a sudden we are seeing a worse job situation, people are going to say, Trump did not make America great. He actually made the economy worse.
Well, the jobs report for November was dismal. So I'm not sure the jobs picture is what we wanted. Unemployment's ticked up to 4.3%. The labor participation rate isn't where we wanted. I'm not sure we're out of the woods yet, but Laura, you reminded me of something. When George H.W. Bush, all that summer, he's running for re-election. He's running against Bill Clinton. And Clinton was the man with the plan. Remember, putting people first. He had this book. It was like a normal campaign document. It flew off the shelves like a bestseller. It was a very interesting campaign. But there was the jobs report came out. I think it was August, and the numbers came out, and inflation was down. Employment was. It was clear we were out of the recession. And Bush said something to the pool. He was jogging. He wasn't normally nasty to the press like Trump is. And he says, I'd like to see the Washington Post spin this or something like that. Well, they did. The Washington Post said, all the numbers are good. But anyway, it didn't matter what the Washington Post wrote. By that time, people had already made up their mind about Bush. And it didn't matter that this recession ended 3 months or 4 months before the election. People decided they didn't want him to have a second term hand on the economy. And I guess what I'm saying is I think that happened to Biden. At some point, the American people tuned him out because he didn't respond in the moment the way they expected or wanted.
Yeah, and I do think that, there was an expectation that Biden was going to be a transitional president. He had somewhat committed to that. And I do think Americans were frustrated because there was this feeling like, why is he still going on? So I also think that they stopped listening to him, which inhibited his ability to communicate his message. I mean, I will stand every single day on the fact that I do think Vice President Harris ran a flawless campaign. I think she brought that campaign and essentially the vote to near a tie at the presidential level. I do not believe if Biden had stayed in the race that he would have done any better. And in fact, I'm certain he would have done worse. And so I do think that the problem was it was just too little, too late, and there were too many messages that were not kind of heard and received. And there was so much nostalgia and sort of memory hole forgetting about the pandemic that no one remembered that actually 4 years ago, people were very bad off.
Yeah. You're listening to Real Clear Politics. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've got Lara Brown with us. We've got about a minute left here, Lara. And I'm just curious, sum up how you think, because you've written about a number of presidents, how you think the world will view Joe Biden overall. You got about a minute. What do you think they'll think of him in 10 years, say?
I think Biden is going to be seen as both a successful legislative president and a somewhat successful foreign policy president. I think he will be credited for bringing international institutions and allies back into the fold and bringing them back closer to America. But I think that there is a reality that Afghanistan withdrawal, even if he says it wasn't his fault precisely, the execution took place under his administration. And I don't think he's really been able to get out from the shadow of that really during his entire presidency.
Well, great. We're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been with Carl Cannon and Lara Brown. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great evening.